our next edition of the e-learning segment. We have looked at work since day one of the e-learning lessons, and we defined work. We looked at some of the types of work we have, some of the importance or benefits that are derived from work. In our previous lesson, that's the last lesson before today, we're looking at work ethics. And we said a lot about work ethics. We said work ethics are simply the behaviors or the way one conducts him or herself at his or her workplace within a given period of time. So the good behaviors and the bad behaviors that we portray in our workplaces are what we put together to be called work ethics. In our previous lesson, a lot was said about positive work ethics. And for that matter, today we'll be looking at the negative aspect of behaviors or attitudes that we also put up in our workplaces. The first negative work attitude or work ethic that we mostly portray at our workplaces include laziness. And when I talk about laziness, we all know and understand what laziness means. At least one can simply define or say something about laziness as using your time for a different purpose rather than increasing productivity. Or a lot of things brings about laziness in the workplace, and if such behaviors are put up in the workplaces, it tends to decrease our productivities in the workplace, and it does not help the company or the institutions in which we find ourselves to progress and then develop. I also speak on one or employee going to work late and then leaving the workplace before the closing time. Yes, when you go to work late, you are supposed to report to work at, let's say, 8 a.m. and then you wait and then tend to report to work or report at work at 10. The 2 hours that has been wasted will also tend to decrease productivity. And then, assuming you're also supposed to close or leave the office at 5 and then you leave at 12 after lunch, you also tend not to help the institution or the work to progress or to prosper. So if such attitudes are inculcated or portrayed, it tends to decrease the productivities of the companies in which we work. And then the third point I also speak about, which is mostly very common in our workplaces, is working lotto and reading newspaper whilst there is work to be done. When there is work to be done, you see some employees gathering somewhere, working lotto and then reading other newspapers at the expense of the work that they are supposed to do. And when all this happens, it tends to decrease productivity. The fourth point I also highlight or center on is about procrastination. Yes, when we talk about procrastination, it simply means the act of putting off or delaying an activity to a later date or time. Assuming you have a task to perform now, and then you think, oh, I have more time, let me relax, let me wait, let me spend some time sleeping or resting, and then I'll do it later. And when that happens, we put it, or we call it, procrastination. When you decide to put off or delay an activity to a later time or date, you have procrastinated. And all this tends to be negative attitudes that we portray in our workplaces. The fifth point I also explain or talk about is theft and pilferage. Somebody asks, hey, what is this big word about? Theft and pilferage simply means, theft is talking about stealing something at the workplace. And then when you talk about pilferage, all it means is that when one steals items of smaller values or quantities at the workplace. Pilferage or pilfering is the act of stealing or taking items of little values or quantities at the workplace. You would think it wouldn't cost the company so much, but when if you make that a habit in the workplace, it tends to also bring the output of the company to at a lower rate. So these are also attitudes or behaviors that must not be encouraged at the workplace. The sixth one I also talk about is accepting bribes before offering to do a piece of work. And you all know what bribes are. Bribes are simply taking something valuable or mostly in monetary term before you offer to do a piece of work or a particular work that has been assigned you. When all this happens, you tend not to help or make the institution or your workplace not grow. The seventh and the final point I also highlight or talk about is when one engages in unnecessary conversations and arguments at the workplace at the expense of productivity. Engaging in unnecessary conversations and arguments at the workplace at the expense of productivity. We are all supposed to help our organizations grow, and every employer is of the view and then the aim of employing someone to work in order to increase the output or productivity of the institution. And as such, if you are employed into a particular organization and then you tend to engage in unnecessary conversations and then do all sorts of arguments with your fellow colleagues or co-workers at the expense of the work, it also tends to decrease the output of the company. And as such, all our advice and talk about is that none of these behaviors are supposed to be encouraged in our workplaces. And as such, we all one day grow to be employees of different institutions in the country. And when it happens that way, once we have been taught today that we must put away all these kind of behaviors at the workplace, it will help our companies in the near future to grow so that we increase the output and the productivities of our companies. Thank you very much as we bring the lesson for today to a close, and I expect to meet you again in our next lesson. Thank you very much for cooperating with me. I am still Mr. Kwakye, your Rme facilitator. Thank you very much.